And a very warm welcome to all of you to this very exciting evening. My name is Nick Dill, for those who don't know me. Ex-lawyer by day, an Anglican bishop by night, a father of 6 and a husband of 1. Formerly, like many people here, I guess, a skeptic when it came to issues of faith, certainly someone who had severe doubts. I would have described myself when I got out of the umbrella of my parents' control as a kind of a hedonist, but tempered by guilt. Anyway, if anyone had said to me in those days that I would be invited or go to an event like such as this, I would never have believed it, and I probably wouldn't have come. So I'm very pleased to see that you're here and that you've been brave enough to come out this evening. And if any of you are in the position that I once was, because I'm no longer in that position, I have a particular affinity with you, and you are particularly welcome. Tonight's a night for asking important questions, and there'll be opportunities for that to happen a little later on this evening, and I'll explain that in just a moment. But just to say, you're not going to be invited to do any of those embarrassing kind of Christian-y things like sing or pray or give money. So you're safe, and no one has to do anything that they don't want to do, except to listen and to take in some of the stuff you'll hear, and to have an opportunity for you to express your own questions and to say what you think, which will happen a little later on. I guess my main task is to kind of explain the process for this evening and to introduce to you the various speakers. And that's a great joy and a delight. Our main speaker tonight is on his second visit to Bermuda. I won't ask for a show of hands for those of you who saw him the first time. I was tempted to introduce him to you as Matthew Ramsbottom. The reason is that he got my name wrong last time when we were in this position on a number of occasions, and it's now gone onto YouTube. So anyway, so people around the world know me as Dick, Bill, or I can't remember what it was that you said, Michael, but anyway. But I'm a forgiving type, and he's literally walked off the plane from the British Airways flight, having been stuck in traffic yesterday and missed the flight. So he says, not wanting to go into the prisons this morning, which is where his 2 compatriots were today, because he's come with reinforcements. So we've got a pincer movement, Michael from Oxford, and then we've got Vince, and we've got Alicia, who come from Atlanta, and they're coming here to be a part of this conversation that we're going to be having tonight, and it's really very exciting. Between them, they have, you were at our correctional facility today, working hard, the 2 of you, weren't you? How was the British Airways food today? Anyway, you can tell us that yourself. But between them, they have been educated in a variety of different places, from Princeton University and Oxford University, and somewhere called Roberts Wesleyan College, which is in somewhere called North Chile, New York. I mean, who knew that there was such a place? Anyway, and they have spoken at a variety of different places around the world, just about every conceivable university you can imagine, in the States, in Europe, in Africa, all sorts of different places. Heard of the White House, the United Nations, NATO, all kinds of different places, to terrorist groups, not that there's any connection, and now back in Bermuda, which is really, really exciting, and it's great to have them here. We're delighted because we're going to be looking at some pretty serious issues, some, I guess, stumbling blocks, you could say, to the Christian faith. There was a time, of course, when Christianity seemed to be a good cohesive glue and a good thing in a society, but those days are gone, and it seems that, for many, it's past its sell-by date, and it's a malevolent force, not rather than a good force, and so maybe it's time to just put the whole thing to bed. And then, of course, there are other issues that face people, the issues of suffering or the reliability of the faith as a whole. And I guess to be touching on some of these issues. And the way it's going to work is this, is that Michael is going to come and speak to us for a little while. I have no idea how long. We'll see. And then there will be a little hiatus or a pause. And during that time, that's when you have an opportunity to write a question, if you have one, if you've come with a question, or if something has stimulated you during the course of what you've heard. Please write the question on either your ticket as you came in, or there are very, very friendly and happy people who've got bits of paper and pens. The thing is, if you write your question, you have 2 ways of delivering it. One in person. There will be an open mic, I think, down here, and you're welcome to come up if you're brave enough to ask a question directly, or just to hand the question along to the end of the row into the center aisle, and someone will pick it up. And then the the three guest speakers will be sitting here, and they will endeavor to answer your questions for you. One thing I do want to add, though, is if you really want to have your question answered, make sure you put your name on there and some contact details, just in case they're not able to cover everything tonight, because we don't want to be here till the early hours of the morning. But to make sure that someone does contact you to deal with any issue that you feel has been unresolved. So please do feel free to do that. As I say, there are pens and paper available if you like. Well, I think I've probably said enough, and you've seen enough of me. That's not why you're here. Is it really? No. So can I introduce Michael Ramsden to you and ask you to give him a very warm Bermuda welcome, please.
Thank you. Well, it is a delight and a privilege to be back here in Bermuda and able to speak to you again, especially having rechristened the bishop. With a variety of names. I'm going to plead that I was tired and ignorant. Anyway, he has to forgive me. He's a Christian, so that's part of his job. But otherwise, it is absolutely wonderful to be back. I was meant to be here, as you may have gathered last night, just to be able to catch my breath before speaking this morning and then speaking to you tonight. But the traffic conspired against me, and so having just walked off the plane, I'm hoping that what I say will make at least some coherent sense to you. If it doesn't, there will be a time of Q&A in which I'll be able to spread the confusion further and deeper. Reminds me of one piece of feedback at the end of one event, a bit like this, where someone came up and said to the speaker, I'm still confused, but at a much higher level than I was before. And hopefully that's not what we'll be doing right now. I have to say, the food at British Airways, I actually decided to spare myself that particular ordeal on this particular flight. They do treat me generally well, although I remember, it was quite a long time ago now, but when British Airways introduced the Concorde service from London to New York, the attraction of it was obviously you landed 3 hours before you took off. So, because you made up the time as you were crossing the Atlantic. And so British Airways had this advertising campaign that said, lunch in London, breakfast in New York. The idea being, you could have an early lunch meeting, fly to New York, and then have a breakfast meeting. And someone, enterprising young person, I guess, with a scan of spray paint, found one of these giant billboards in London and added their own line at the bottom. So now the slogan read, lunch in London, breakfast in New York, luggage in India. And it's, these things don't always go according to plan. Now, I've been asked to share a few thoughts with you about this subject of has the Christian faith failed, which is a very tricky question to deal with. And like most difficult and challenging questions, the temptation can always be to hedge everything you say in so many different ways that you're trying to give so many different opinions, it sounds like that you're informed about everything, but you're giving no definite answer. And we sometimes think that that's a sort of very generous, open-minded way of dealing with those kinds of things. Of course, there are some questions which need to be answered. It's like the story of the boy who was asked by his geography teacher at school, what is the capital of France? And replied, well, I like to keep an open mind on the issue. There are some questions which actually deserve and should actually have some kind of answer given to them. And so even though this one is particularly challenging, that's what we'll be trying to do tonight. And I'm going to couch my remarks to you in three very broad categories. We're going to look at the question of whether the Christian faith has philosophically failed. Then we'll look at it whether it's sort of personally, sort of existentially failed in terms of our own personal experience. And then that's going to lead into the third category of moral failure. And there are a variety of ways of dealing with the criticism or the question put to the Christian faith of has it morally failed. But one of the biggest of those is actually to do with the question of suffering. Namely, if God is a good God, then why is this world so messed up in the way we see it to be? And one of my colleagues who was with me, Dr. Vince Vitale, has both done his doctorate at that area at Oxford University and published a book on it. And so what we'll do is, after I finish talking, while you have this pause to write down your own question, both him and Alicia are going to come and join me up on stage, and I'm going to put the first question to Vince about suffering, and to give him a fair stab, to give him at least 10 minutes or so to be able to deal at least with some of those issues that's raised by that question. And then we'll move into the time of Q&A with you. So hopefully between us we'll be able to cover as many bases as we possibly can. Now, this whole question of has the Christian faith failed you, let me just try to start off with a couple of, one main point of definition. Because when you ask that question, has Christianity failed? The question is, well, how do we define that? What does that mean? And if we're talking in terms of Christians and the church, then the answer is definitely there are times, both in history and in present, where the church and Christians have failed, where we've done things that we shouldn't have done and where we have got things wrong. And in that sense, it's very important for Christians themselves to remember that in the book of Revelation, it's the church that's commanded to repent by God, where he challenges the church and he speaks to them about their attitude and their belief and what they've reduced the Christian gospel and Jesus Christ into, rather than following him wholeheartedly. Mercifully, even though there have been times when the church, sometimes for prolonged periods of time, has been out of step with what God would want and what he's taught, it has also been revived. The great skeptic who was also converted, a guy called G.K. Chesterton, very famously said there have been 5 times in history when the church has gone to the dogs, but in each case it's been the dog that's died. Hopefully there is that sense that even when the church does get it wrong, there are those within it who are still wanting to ask that question, are we right? What would God himself say to us directly? But if we're asking the question about the person of Jesus Christ and what he taught and said, and has he failed, then the answer to that question, I believe, is no. And this is one of these very interesting things that the Bible speaks to, that even though we may be faithless at times, God is actually faithful. And so I want to urge you, right at the very, very beginning, and I'm going to do this again in the second part of my presentation, please don't be discouraged if you've encountered people who claim to be Christian, but you're sure that they're fake. That's a problem that has been around for a long time, and we will come to that in a moment. What I find very interesting is I remember once talking with a bank teller who was explaining to me how their bank trained their tellers to spot the difference between a genuine note and a fake note. And the interesting thing is the way they train them is they don't allow the bank tellers, when they're in training, to handle any fake money. They only allow them to handle the original. The reason is that there's no limit to the number of fakes you can have, but there's only one genuine article. And so the goal is that they become so familiar with that genuine article, with its smell, its feel, how it is in the hand, its look, that when they see a fake, whatever the fake is, they can recognize there's something wrong here. In other words, you can't give enough instruction on error, but you can sufficiently teach truth to recognize error when it then comes along. And so with that sort of preamble, let me just jump straight into these 3 main headings that we have. First of all, let's just deal with the question about has the Christian faith philosophically failed? Now, when we ask that question, what we generally mean, I think what's in most people's imaginations at that point, goes something like this. Look, Christianity is a faith, which is different from the truth. Faith is believing something in the absence of evidence. So the trouble with the Christian faith is it's not capable of being true or false. You just believe it. You're not interested in evidence or facts or truth or anything like that. It's a question of what you want to believe. Now, the challenge with that particular definition of faith is believing what you want to believe, is that would mean, therefore, that strong faith would mean believing in something which you suspect isn't true, but you're able to believe it anyway. Because that would be really strong faith, right? And the strongest possible kind of faith you could have is when you know something isn't true and you're able to believe it. Because that requires like an enormous amount of faith. Now, it's true that the Bible defines faith as a gift, but it's not the gift of stupidity. It's not the gift of being able to believe something that isn't there or isn't real. There's only one Greek word used in the New Testament which we translate faith, and actually in the language there are 2. In the Greek language there are 2 words for faith. You can have the word pistis or the word nomizo. Now nomizo comes from the Greek word nomos, which means by law or custom. And when you talk about faith that comes from nomos, what you mean is, well, there is no real reason apart from the fact that my father did it. And if you ask an ancient Greek, well, why did your father go to the temple? Well, my grandfather went. Well, why did your grandfather go? Well, my great-grandfather went. I mean, eventually you're going to say, look, that's just what we do. So when you're asking why, that's all you can get. This is our custom. And there's no reason behind it. But the only time you'll ever read the word faith in the New Testament is always translated from the verb pistis, which is a noun derived from the verb pito, to be persuaded. It means to be sure about something, particularly in a moral sense of the word. So, if I were to say to you, look, I have faith in Bishop, what name shall we give him today? Shall we use Nick, or maybe we should call him Michael? Actually, Bishop Michael sounds nice. Let's run with Bishop Michael. If I were to say, look, I have faith in the bishop, I'm saying two things about him. Number one, he actually exists. He is real. Even if you didn't want him to exist, tough. Okay? He's not going away because you decide not to believe in him anymore. And secondly, that I could trust his promise. I can trust his word. If he says, yeah, sure, look, we'll help organize something if you come back, that I can rely on him. So faith is always in response to that reality and that truth. You can't have faith outside of that. That's the only way in which we really use the word faith in any way that makes real sense. So if I talk about having faith in the British government, which, given our current political situation, really would be quite a leap at the moment, it would seem, I'm saying again those two things. One, it's actually a real thing. It's not a made-up thing, it's real. And two, I think I can trust what they're saying. So when we talk about a faithless friend or an unfaithful lover, what we're saying is someone whom I trusted their word, I trusted their promise, I trusted what they said, has broken faith with me. Does that make sense? I was relying on them, I was leaning on them, I was trusting them, and they've betrayed me. And then we feel that sense of faithlessness or being unfaithful. So when the Bible talks about having faith in God, it's not asking you to do a leap in the dark. As a matter of fact, that phrase, a leap in the dark, is found nowhere in Scripture. The Bible always talks about the idea of putting your faith in God as like a stepping into the light. And when you step into the light, it's so you can see. You can actually see what is there. In other words, the Bible talks about faith as putting your trust, your complete weight, your truth, into a God who is both true and real. You can depend on him, he is real, and you can rely on his promises. He's not the kind of person who promises you bread and gives you a stone, or will offer you a fish only to deliver a scorpion. He can be trusted both in his word and in his reality. And so then the fundamental question is, do you know him? In other words, faith isn't wishful thinking. I hope this might be true. In the same way we may talk about my football team's going to win this year. And now, of course, we could be let down in all kinds of ways, especially if you support Oxford United, who make a speciality of disappointing other people. But it breeds resilience. That's just wishful thinking. That's hoping something might eventually happen. But faith is different from that. It carries with it, therefore, a certain type of certainty. And in that sense, we all have faith in someone and also in other things as well, things that we're sure are true. And maybe, therefore, the other way of illustrating this is to say, therefore, that faith is justified by her object. What do I mean by that? Well, if I want to sit on this chair that's next to me, two things have to be real, true. Does that make sense? Or sensible. The first one is that there's an actual chair, a real chair. I can't just try to sit on my faith. Does that make sense? It would be funny, but painful. And the second thing is that it's got enough integrity, truth, to support my weight of about 70 kilos or so. And if the chair is both real and able to support the weight that's put into it, then I'm justified in what I've done. Faith is always justified by her object. So that is why the Christian faith is capable of being challenged and being proved to be untrue. That makes sense. It's not a question of what do you want to believe. The question is, what is actually real? And even if God is real, can you trust what he says? Is he trustworthy? Can you put your faith in him or not? So this attack, if you like, or this criticism, the Christian faith isn't capable of being true or false, is wrong, once you understand what real faith looks like. As a matter of fact, the English dictionary, if you pick up a really old version of it, will be very, very clear about this, because even in the English language, the word faith was actually a verb up until the Middle English period. And even Chaucer and Shakespeare, who lived during the Middle English period, used the verb faith. To have faith was a distinction from just simple belief. Belief was speculation. Maybe this is true, but I'm not sure. But to have faith was to say, I know this is real, and I know this is true, and therefore I can put my complete weight on it. I can rely on it completely, totally, and without exception. Which is why the Christian faith always, therefore, has invited historical criticism, which is why it's always invited, and should always invite those with difficult questions, and with those who have struggles, because that's how your faith then grows. The way your reliance on something grows is the more you question it, the more it stands up, the stronger it is. So hence, the more certain you are of it. The more you question it, and the less it goes down, in a sense, proves to be weak, the less you can rely on it. And so faith, therefore, grows and strengthens in relationship to truth and knowledge. You need those two things. Which is why there's a verse in the Bible, very famously in Hebrews 11:6, where it says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And if you need faith, therefore, to please God, the next question you better ask yourself is, well, what is it? And very usefully, the Bible defines it. And faith is. The very next sentence. And faith is knowing that he is. That's a statement about reality. God is actually there. And, some of you in the room will know this off by heart, and is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. In other words, you can trust his promise. You can trust him. You can trust everything he's given. You can put your faith in him. So it's very important, therefore, that at this, if you like, philosophical level, we understand that asking questions is fine and it's okay. And if you're wrestling with questions, then I would urge you, this event's been put on tonight specifically for you to be able to ask them. And we would invite you, ask your questions that you may have. We would love to hear you, and we would love to try and give a response to them. And anything I can't answer, my colleagues most certainly can. But let's just move then from this philosophical idea, is the Christian faith actually capable of being true? And I'm saying, yes, it is, to this maybe more pertinent issue about just our personal struggle. Because there's also this other sense, this existential encounter with God, if you like, our experience of him, where we can feel let down. And that's something which is very real. I remember once joking that this group consisted largely of people who went to church and realized they didn't like their vicar, or vicars who went to church and realized they didn't like the congregation that was in front of them. It's a broader group than that. But it's this sense of, God, look, I'm doing my best. And I'm basically a good person, but it doesn't seem to be working for me. My encounter of life, my walk in it isn't, I feel, being sort of rewarded in some way. So help me understand, therefore, this sense of disappointment I have. Well, let's just deal first of all with people who have that sense of disappointment with the church that we've alluded to in the introduction. One of the earliest Christian writings in the New Testament is the book of Galatians. We're not sure which is the earliest part of the New Testament, but the book of Galatians is right up there with a chance of being one of the very first things ever written by a Christian. And it was written by a guy called Paul, who was one of the first converts to the Christian faith. And he'd moved from a point of extreme skepticism. He enjoyed killing Christians and torturing them, a thing which some of you in this room may feel you connect with right now, and to suddenly becoming this ardent believer and planter of churches. And following his conversion, he wrote to this group of Christians in Galatia. And in the book of Galatians, he has two primary concerns. Actually, there are lots of concerns he has in that letter, but there are two really big ones. The very first one is, you need to understand what this gospel actually is. We're going to come back to that in a minute. He said, because there's one gospel, one good news that actually is bad news. But then he's also very interested in what is a real Christian? What does a real Christian look like? And the Apostle Paul basically says, look, you shouldn't just believe someone because they says, I'm a Christian. He says, that's not enough. You need to look at their heart and their life. And there's a very famous saying where he gets into chapter 5 of this letter. It's 6 chapters long. And in chapter 5, verse 28, he says, look, if you're a Christian, there should be a fruit in your life. The word is in the singular. He says you should be able to taste this fruit. And it should taste of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. In other words, what the Apostle Paul is saying to his critics is he's saying, bite me, but in a very, very nice way. And he's saying, you're questioning what's going on. Well, you should be able to taste the fruit of my life, he says. You should be able to taste my life And you should be able to taste the difference. Because once you've come to know Christ, the human heart, this is what it should look like. Love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, and so on. This very famous list. He says, however, if what you taste is anger, rage, malice, lust, evil, if that's what you're tasting, then even though someone's claiming to be Christian, you have every right to question the reality of it. In the same way, if someone offered you an apple, and it looked a bit like a pear, and then you tasted it, and it tasted like a pear, chances are it's not an apple. And Paul's saying exactly the same thing. Don't necessarily say yes to anyone who claims, yes, I'm a Christian. Look at their life. Taste the reality of it. Look for it. And if you have been in any way upset or driven away because of your personal experience with people who claim to be Christian, then I am very sorry about that. But as I said, please don't reject the possibility of the real because you've simply engaged a fake in the past. I can't remember if I shared this story or not. I'm trying to remember the chain of events. I think when I was with you here last year, I hadn't been to Africa yet. I think I was about to head off to Africa. Was I here in April last year? I can't even remember what time of year I was here. Goes to show how good my memory is. And I was going to a place in northern Nigeria called Jos, which is a city which is fairly well known. It made the headlines a few years ago for all the wrong reasons when 274 girls were kidnapped. Do you remember this story? And then sold into slavery. And there were people all around the world holding up these signs with the hashtag, to get these girls back. And not all of them have been returned yet, by the way. They're still trying to find many of them. And as I was getting ready to go and speak there, I was having a taxi ride in Oxford, and I got talking to my taxi driver and, introduced myself, and he introduced himself. And when he gave me his name, I said, that's an amazing name. Does it have a meaning? And he explained the meaning of his name. And I said, are you Nigerian? He said, yes, I am. And I said, do you have a Christian background? He said, well, I used to be, but not anymore. He said, I want nothing to do with the church. He says, why do you ask? I said, well, I have bad news for you. You have an evangelist riding in the back of your cab. He said, and I said, what's more, I'm going to Nigeria in a couple of weeks. And he says, and then he began to pour out this tale of woe, and I won't go into all of it, how he was cheated and swindled and betrayed and misled, by some leaders in his church. And when he'd finished speaking, I said to him, can I ask you another different question? And he said, sure. I said, has anyone ever given you any fake money? And I was surprised at how quickly he replied. He said, yes, like that, immediately. And I said, does that mean when we get to the end of this journey and I offer you a £20 note to settle the bill, that you won't accept it because in the past someone's given you something fake? And he said, and he went very quiet. And then I said, you're a smart man. I think you understand what I'm saying. He said, I do. I said, please don't reject the possibility of the real because in the past someone's tried to give you some kind of fake. I said, look for the reality of what is actually claiming to be. Look for that. But there's another side to this personal, if you like, sense of disillusionment, which is also addressed with, not just like people claiming to be a Christian, but it comes from our side. This whole idea of, God, I'm trying to uphold my end of the bargain, but I just don't feel you're there for me. And that argument goes, as I say, something like this. Look, I'm basically a good person, and I'm doing my best, and I try my best, but God, where are you? Where are you in the midst of all of this? And there's a very difficult reply to that particular question that's not very easy to give. In the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul also not simply talks about real Christians and fake Christians, he also talks about the real gospel and the fake gospel. And as I said, he says there is a gospel of good news about God that's actually no good news at all. He says, as a matter of fact, cursed is anyone who believes it and cursed is anyone who preaches it. It's a very strong, like double negative. He's saying it's bad for the one who speaks it and it's bad for the person who receives it. And this message, which sounds like it could be good news but is actually really bad news, is this message that says, well, if I do my best for God, then God's obliged to do his best for me. And he says, that's not what this is about at all. He says, if that's what you think, then you're not even close to understanding what the Christian gospel is all about, ultimately, he says. For at least two reasons. And I say, neither of these answers are easy to give. First of all, we're not good people. I know we like to think of ourselves that way, and I know I shared this the last time I was here, so please forgive me if I'm repeating it, but if you're sat here this evening and you honestly believe you're perfect, you've never done anything wrong, the only way out of that particular state of self-deception is to get married. And that will disabuse you of that illusion almost straight away. This then raises this rather more basic question. Well, if it's not then about me trying to be good, that makes sense. If we're all, in this room, if we've all messed up, if we've all done things wrong, what distinguishes one person from another? And Paul is trying to say, well, look, here's the difference. He's saying this whole motivation in the Christian life to do good things and this change of heart doesn't come about because you're trying to do good to impress God. He says that's not how it works. He's saying rather, God is interested in forgiving you. He's offering you forgiveness. And if you receive that forgiveness that he's offering you as a gift, it will completely change who you are. Literally, he's saying, we're all in this mess. And God comes to us and offers, hey, here's forgiveness. And if you say yes to that forgiveness, you are forgiven. And the whole thing is, if you are forgiven, you don't need to do anything anymore to endear yourself to the other person. It doesn't make sense. You may want to out of love, but not because you have to, simply because you want to. We're very bad at saying sorry in this world, and we're very, very bad at seeking and receiving forgiveness. And I think it's why it's sometimes very hard for us to understand that this is what's right at the heart of the Christian faith and the Christian gospel. This message from Jesus Christ isn't God wants you to try harder to impress him. That's not the message. The message is that while you were still God's enemies and you were a long way from him, God wanted to reconcile you to him, and that's why I've come to draw you to him, and I'm doing that by offering forgiveness. And if you say yes to that forgiveness, then you are forgiven. And it changes everything. It's very interesting. My parents live in Cyprus. I'm one of those sort of global families where I've got one brother now living in America, another one living in the Middle East, my parents living in Cyprus, and getting family reunions together is very, very difficult. But it's interesting, just yesterday I was talking about this particular story with my mother. But I can remember when I was about 14 years old, my mother wanted to introduce me to one of her friends, and I'm sure you probably all had this experience when you were a teenager and your parents really wanted you to meet one of their friends, and you meet them, and after about half an hour you're thinking, how do I get out of this? And so eventually I made my excuses and I left, and my mother afterwards said, were you excited to meet them? And I'm thinking, is that one of those trick questions where if I tell the truth I get into trouble? And so I can't remember how I replied, but it was something like, well, why did you want me to meet them? And my mother looked at me and said, have I never told you the story? And then I heard the story about why this woman wanted to meet me. Now we were back visiting the country. We were living in the Middle East now. We'd moved. The reason she wanted to see me is that when I was about 2 years old, my mother took me to a park in the town that we were living in at the time, and she was chatting to a friend, and I'd crawled over to the edge of a river, and I wanted, obviously, I don't know, I guess to touch the water, and I just fell in. And my mother didn't even notice. But this friend of hers was walking along the bank, and she saw me fall in. And she yelled, and my mother looked up to see her best friend running as fast as she could along the river bank and then jumping into the river. And my mother thought, she's nuts, this woman. What's wrong with her? And then this woman stood up in the river holding me. And now all of a sudden my mother's now running towards the woman, to take me out of her arms, and then helps her out of the river, over the riverbank, back up onto dry land. And this woman wanted to come and meet now this 14-year-old boy who was still alive. And as soon as my mother explained to me that, I remember saying to her, is there any way you could invite her back? Because this time I just want to say thank you. That's the most natural reaction in the world, isn't it? If someone comes and saves your life and rescues you, you want to say thank you. And the motivation in the Christian life to want to spend time with God or to live differently has got nothing to do with trying to impress him. It's because if he has genuinely come into this world to rescue and to forgive and to save us, you want to spend time with him, and you want to say thank you. That's what worship is primarily about, is expressing all of that thanks. Thank you, you love me so much. You came to do this for me and to rescue me. And it becomes the major driving force in the Christian faith, to want to live differently. And so it's inevitably the case, if you've been trying to live a life to impress God by doing all the right things, you may be feeling pretty empty about it right now, because it's going to feel very much like a one-way equation. That's not what it's about at all. God isn't asking you to do something in order to be accepted by him. He's offering you a gift, and he's saying, will you say yes? I mean, just imagine how your own parents would feel if at your birthday they're offering you a present and you felt before you could receive it, you had to do various things to impress them to get it. I mean, first of all, it would be confusing to them. And secondly, even when you get the present, it's no longer a gift anymore. Does that make sense? It's now something which you've earned. But that's why Jesus also talks about salvation as a gift. It's something that he's earned to actually pass on to us, and it should then change everything else about us and how we live. Well, the third area then, about then these moral questions we have about God. Well, those are also very profound and very important. As I said, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to invite my colleague Vince and Elisha to come up with me. I'm going to put the first question to him. But let me just introduce this particular section this way. These moral questions that we have about God's character are really important. Because what we're basically asking in all of these questions is, God, are you really fair? Are you actually good or not? Some people think Nietzsche was an out-and-out atheist, but that's not strictly true. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was slightly more nuanced than that. He said, even if there is a God, he's so bad we should fight against him. Does that make sense? In other words, we're basically morally good, and if there is a God, well, he's morally bad, and as good people, we should fight against him even though he can squish us. And so that was part of, if you like, his argument against the whole thing. And in that sense, it's a very, very profound question. Because it links back then into that very first issue about faith, trust. Who can you ultimately trust? If God is somehow morally equivocal, he's not actually basically good. Sometimes he's good and sometimes he's bad, and you don't know which side of the bed he woke up on that day when you come before him. Well, I don't know if any of you ever had the pain of witnessing an abusive relationship or even being in one. The trouble is, if you're ever caught in a relationship like that, every time you come into their presence, you don't know if they're going to hug you or hit you. So you become very guarded. You become very, very careful when you're in their presence because you don't want to provoke anything that's going to get you into trouble. And if God isn't basically good, if he can't be trusted, then we have an enormous problem when it comes to putting your faith in him. Because how can you put your faith in someone, your trust in someone, if they're not actually good? I mean, you have to be nuts to do that. And so the question about, is God actually morally good or trustworthy, becomes very, very, very important. And when we raise these big moral questions, therefore, about God, it's going right to the very heart of the Christian faith. God, can we trust you? Now, there is one area also which I'm going to just briefly touch on before we move into the suffering side of this, which is, aside from suffering, the other really big problem we have with God's moral character is to do with the nature of his judgment. It's all one thing for you Christians to talk about a God who loves and all that kind of stuff. But how can we worship a God who judges us? How's that actually even possible? And let me suggest at least two things just to bear in mind while we process that. If you've ever experienced some kind of gross injustice in your life, you will know how much you crave for it to be put right. When you've seen grave injustice in your life, or to a group of people who are close to you, the idea that someone will come along and pass judgment on it makes you sing. Makes sense? Finally, someone in authority will come and speak and do something about the situation and actually address the wrong that I see. It's a basic cry of every human heart. And we long about it. And when it happens, we tell stories about it. And some of our heroes around the world are people who in their nation actually did bring that about. So wouldn't it be strange if somehow God had no interest in justice whatsoever? That he never spoke out about that which was wrong? That would make him a very strange type of being. How can he simply approve of everything? We live in a very confusing time, and I'll be speaking a little bit about this at a different meeting I'll be speaking at tomorrow morning when we talk about division in our current society. But right now in our world, most of our cries for justice are motivated by anger. I don't know if you've noticed that. You may have seen that. Most of the cries for justice that I see around the world in every country I go to are motivated by anger right now. The problem with that is that when we're pursuing justice out of anger, even when we get justice, we're left with anger. And that's a very literally bitter pill to swallow. It causes all kinds of problems. And at a human level, we very often confuse justice with revenge. So we think justice is getting what we want, or getting our own back. I don't know, do any of you ever watch James Bond movies? Don't be ashamed if you watch those. Just put up your hand. How many of you watch those? Oh, Shame on you. I can't condone watching that kind of rubbish. I have to watch all those movies because of the cultural research I do about trends. But I remember going to see the movie GoldenEye when it first came out. I'd been invited into the cinema and I was very excited. It was completely packed. And I don't know if you've seen that particular movie. But the way it ends in the way all James Bond movie ends. James Bond is fighting the arch villain. And he's almost going to die, but he doesn't die because James Bond never dies. No one's died almost as many times as James Bond. And of course, the final set is always spectacular. There's this huge lake on an island. I can't remember where exactly. And the lake drains away. And there's this massive bowl, concrete basin, maybe 200 meters wide, maybe 100 meters deep. And it's a giant radar controlling a satellite in outer space. And James Bond and the bad guy are fighting on the metal needles suspended by long wires over the middle of this radar array. And so as they're fighting on this metal spiky needle, all of a sudden the positions are reversed, and now James Bond is safe and the bad guy is literally hanging on by his fingertips. And James Bond's thinking, am I meant to rescue you now? I was just trying to kill you, but as a gentleman, do I now save you or what? And at that point, the guy loses his grip and he begins to fall all the way down to the bottom of this radar dish. It's a 100-meter fall. You see him screaming all the way down as he goes, ah, like that. And then they have a camera from the ground, so you can see the body rushing towards the ground. Does that make sense as it's going down and down? Then you have a camera from the needle, and you can see the body getting smaller and smaller and smaller as it's getting closer to the ground. Then you have the wide-angle camera or the close-up camera, whatever. You have a camera like it's in his eyes. He can see the ground rushing up towards him. Okay, you get multiple views, because that's what you want to happen at the James Bond movie. You don't want the bad guy caught and put on trial and then locked up for 12 years. You want the bad guy killed. And he has to know he has to be killed. He can't be accidentally killed or hit by a bus he didn't see coming. He has to know he's going to die, and then it has to take a lot of time, and then he has to die, really painfully. So you see every single conceivable camera angle, and the body's falling all the way down, and then the guy lands on this concrete surface. And of course, you think he's dead. And even without medical training, I know if you fall 100 meters and land on your head, you're dead. But is he dead? Oh no. He opens his eyes just in time to see a massive explosion right above his head release the large metal needle, which is conveniently situated directly above his mouth, 100 meters in the sky. Now you see the needle coming down towards the man lying on the ground. You hear the guy screaming all the way as the needle comes down. Ah! You have a camera on this big metal needle looking down, so you can see his head getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You have the camera coming out of the guy's eyes, looking up as he's screaming, so you can see the needle coming down and down and down. And then the camera goes through his mouth and skewers him into the ground. Now he's dead, and I remember when that happened, the whole auditorium rose to its feet and started clapping like this, because the bad guy got it. And when we think about God's judgment, that's what we often imagine, somehow some kind of glorified revenge. But interestingly, also in the Bible, God says, I take pleasure in the death of no one. So there's something else which is very interesting about God's justice. It's not driven by a motivation for revenge. As I say, when anger drives your quest for justice in this world, even when you get justice, you're left with anger and bitterness. But if your quest for justice in this world is driven by love, when you get justice, what you're left with is love. And as the Bible talks about God's judgment, it also promises something else too. That yes, you and I have all messed up and there aren't any good people in this room. But that God's also willing to come into this world and has come into this world to actually take the full force of that judgment to himself. In other words, he's willing to pay the price for what we've done wrong so we can know forgiveness. So when Christ talks about the coming judgment and the judgment he comes to bring, it's not because he wants to condemn the world. He says the world is already in that mess. I've come to save it. And the reason I've come to save it is because I love you. For God so loved the world, he sent his only son. Love isn't the result of the cross. It's the reason for the cross. The reason God came into this world in order to bring about forgiveness, reconciliation, peace isn't because he was against it in that sense. He was for us, but he was against all the terrible injustice that's been done. And he knew that someone had to pay to put it right, and he was willing to do it. And so, the more you look into these moral questions about the nature of God's character and what's actually happening in that story, the more incredible it becomes and the more deeply in love you fall in love with him. At least that's been my experience. But what I'd like to do at this point, if I may, is I'm going to invite both Alicia and Vince to come join me up here on this platform. Please do welcome as they come up. And okay, that's enough. That was longer than you clapped me, so we have to have a pecking order. You're about to find out why I was so keen for them to join me here, both more articulate and more brilliant than I could ever hope to be. And while you're thinking about the questions that you would like to write down or potentially ask at the microphone, and there will be ushers, as you've heard, coming up and down the middle, I'm going to, should I sit in the middle? No, why don't you sit there, Vince? You take this microphone. I'm going to put the first question to Vince, which is, Vince, the one thing we haven't talked about tonight is this whole question of suffering, which for many people is one of the biggest stumbling blocks. How do you go about trying to understand what does it mean if God is actually good and loving, yet we see all of this mess around us?
Thanks, Michael. I'll be happy to say a few words to that, and glad that you made it, glad that you're here. When I got the text yesterday saying that Michael wasn't going to make it, I wanted him to send me a picture because I had a sneaking suspicion he had made it, but he was just lying on a Bermudian beach. Thinking Vince can do my talk last night instead. But I always appreciate speaking with Michael because usually when you have some ideas in your mind, you have a joke or an illustration and you think, is that a little bit too far to the line? Like, could that possibly offend some people in the room? But when I'm speaking with Michael, I never worry about that. I think whatever illustration I have, he's going to break out a James Bond illustration like that. I think I'll be fine. This question of suffering is a really significant one, and I think the first time I was ever asked about this as a Christian, I grew up in a non-Christian family. I went on a journey through my college years. I was very skeptical initially. I came to see that God wanted me to love him with my mind. I was studying philosophy at the time. I thought I could get behind that. I began to examine the evidence. Ultimately, I gave my life to Christ and began to experience much of what Michael spoke to. But my Aunt Regina, probably the first time I was asked this question as a Christian, she spoke with me about some of the suffering in my cousin Charles' life. Charles has some disabilities which have caused serious suffering, and she was talking to me about how difficult that is for Charles and then for her as well. And I began to spout some of my philosophical explanations for why God might allow suffering such as Charles is. And Aunt Regina listened to me very graciously, and then she turned to me and she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." So I've always been slower to try to respond to this question since then. And Jesus was a lot better at that than me. You know, when his good friend Lazarus died, Jesus had waited a couple of days before he went to see him. And reading between the lines in the Gospels, when he got there, Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, were not too impressed. And they were saying, "Jesus, why didn't you come sooner? If you had been here, our brother would still be alive." And surely, at that point, I believe as a Christian, Jesus could have given an explanation. He could have given an answer. He could have explained why he had to wait those days before he came. But that's not what's recorded. In fact, we get the shortest verse in the whole Bible: Jesus wept. And to me, that's very significant. I genuinely believe that my God weeps more tears than any of us for the suffering of this world. And that's very important to me in terms of who I worship. A couple of thoughts that I will share. It'll be an inadequate answer because this is a big question and it's a very personal question for every one of us, but hopefully it'll point us in a few directions. Whenever I'm asking a good question, I always like to turn it around and make sure that I'm having integrity about asking it of myself as well. So if I'm asking this question, God, why would you be responsible for suffering? I want to make sure I'm turning that question around and asking it of myself as well. Am I responsible for suffering? And there's a boy named Ewan that I used to fight with as a teenager. I wasn't a very nice kid. He wasn't a very nice kid either. And I can remember taking every opportunity that I could to push him down. The very same free will that God gave me to help him up, I used it to push him down. And a number of years ago, I learned that Ewan had taken his life. And there's a place in the Bible where it reads, "For the wages of sin is death." And I had probably read that verse hundreds of times before I heard that news, and never had it struck me the way that it did then. And I had to start asking some questions of myself. Would Ewan have taken his life had I been kind to him? Had I used that free will God had given me to help him up rather than to push him down? And I didn't know the answers to those questions. Sometimes when I talk about the concept of sin and its relationship to suffering to people, they want to tell me that I'm exaggerating, that really I'm pretty good. It's not like I've killed anyone. And the reality is that's a much harder question for me to answer than you might realize. And what if God shone a light not just on the rippling effects of my unkindness to Ewan, but on the rippling effects of all of my unkindness throughout the years? So just as a starting point, when we start to ask this question of suffering and who's responsible for it, let's make sure, yes, let's ask it of God. He loves our questions. But let's also ask it of ourselves as well. And I think sometimes we need to be humble enough. Michael mentioned G.K. Chesterton earlier. G.K. Chesterton was once asked to write into a newspaper in response to the question, "What's wrong with the world?" And he wrote in a very short article, he wrote, "Dear sirs, I am sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." There has to be something of that response in our hearts to this question as well. A couple more thoughts. Let me tell you two of my favorite family stories. Italian-American background, we have lots of stories, and these are two of my favorite ones. The first one is my parents' second date. They're standing at this point on the Brooklyn Bridge. They've fallen in love over New Year's on their first date. Now they're on their second date. They're standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, and my dad notices a ring on my mom's finger. So he asks about it, and she says, "Well, that's just some ring one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice." And my dad said, "Oh yeah, it is nice. Let me see it." So she took it off, handed it to my dad. And I love that you're already responding that way. I've told this story in England. No one responds at this point. And I think people are so polite, they can't see what's coming. Tell this story in New York, everyone's laughing, they know exactly what's about to happen. Hands the ring to my dad. My dad hurls it off the bridge, and he watches it sink to the bottom of the East River. He says, "You're with me now. You won't be needing that anymore." And my mom loved it. Now, how is this relevant to this question of suffering? I promise you it's relevant. It's relevant because what if my mom had responded differently? Now, she loved it. I think that was the clinching moment for them. But what if she had decided, you know what, this guy's a bit nuts. I better run back with the old boyfriend instead. Now, what would that have meant for me? Now, I might be tempted to think, hey, maybe I would have been better off. Maybe, the old boyfriend, maybe he would have been taller, maybe he would have been smarter, maybe he would have been more athletic, maybe he would have been better looking, maybe he would have lived in a castle. That would have been cool. It could have been royalty. But there's a philosophical mistake with thinking that way, right? Because if my mom wound up with the old boyfriend rather than my dad, it wouldn't have been me who came to exist. Maybe some other child would have come to exist, and maybe that child would have enjoyed living in a castle. But part of what makes me who I am is my beginning. The parents that I have, the sperm and egg that I came from, the combination of genes that's true of me. Sometimes I think that we long, understandably so, to take some piece of suffering out of this world while keeping everything else the same. I'm not so sure that it works that way. Sometimes when we picture ourselves in this world of suffering, and then we picture ourselves in a very different world with far less suffering or no suffering, and then we think to ourselves, well, surely God, you should have made me in this other world with no suffering. We forget to ask the question, would it have been me if I came to exist, if I had been born into that very different world? Even the throwing of a ring off of a bridge can have an effect on who comes to exist. Well, what if God stepped in and just took away our free will every time we thought to hurt someone? What if he changed the laws of thermodynamics and the way that the universe works? What if he made big scale changes like that? Would it be the people in this room who would have come to exist? Could it be the case that if we take seriously the biblical idea that God chose people even before the foundation of the world, that he knew people before they were born, that he set people apart, that he knitted people together in their wombs, could it be the case that one of the reasons that God allows for this world, even in its broken state, is because he desired every one of us and every person that we love and every person that we see walking down the street? Now, sometimes when I share that idea with people, their response is, well, why us? Why would God choose to create us when surely he could have created some more impressive creatures who maybe would have been less prone to suffering? And it's a good question. It's a biblical question. Psalm 8, which says, God, why are you mindful of humankind? But to refer back to what Michael was speaking on, God's love for us, it's not based on how impressive we are. It's not based on the fact that God could have created these beings which would have been more excellent than us. What if God just found himself with a love for us? I have a 10-week-old son at home, and when I look down at him, there's nothing in what he does that could earn my love for him. I mean, all he's really doing right now is going to the bathroom and going to the bathroom again and again. Right? He's not in a position to earn my love. My love is simply based on the fact that I was involved in creating him, that he is, in one sense, in my image, that he is my child, he is my son. And that's all it takes for my love for him to be utterly, utterly extravagant. What if God loves each one of us like that? You know, I said at the beginning, my Aunt Regina spoke with me about the suffering in my cousin Charles's life. Well, there's some people who would say it would have been better off if Charles never existed. After all, the world would have had less suffering overall. If Charles didn't exist with the disabilities that he was born with, there would have been less suffering in this world. Okay, I couldn't more strongly disagree with that statement. It's because I knew Charles intimately that his suffering was so frustrating to me, but it's also because I knew Charles intimately that I could understand why God, out of grace, would love him so much, and why God might be willing to, at least for a time, endure a broken world that would allow for him to come to exist and for him to call him into relationship with himself for all eternity. One more family story. I was 6 years old, the most vivid story from my childhood. I was playing football, American football, on next door neighbor's front lawn. I was getting knocked around pretty good. I started crying, and I came running home to my mom, who was on the front porch, and I was saying, I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough. So what did my mom do? My mom did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do. She positioned herself like this. She got down in quite an athletic stance, hung her nose out in the air, looked at me lovingly, and she said, punch me in the nose. She said, you are tough enough. Punch me in the nose. I know what you're thinking. Crazy Americans. But she persisted. At first, I looked at her like she was crazy, and indeed she was, but she persisted. She said, punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose. And I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in at the time, but finally I did. I reared back, and I actually gave my mom a punch to the nose. And to my astonishment, and to my mom's astonishment, blood actually began to come out of my mom's nose and drip down her face. Then came just one of the most gorgeous images from my childhood. Through this blood that was coming down my mom's face came the most radiant, just vibrant, dazzling smile. My mom said, now get back out there. And she sent me back out into that game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. Now, you might not know what to make of that story. Okay, understandably so. What an unthinkable, messy, bloody thing for my mom to do. And I'm not recommending it, but in at least one sense, what an extravagant display of love. My mom chose to bring me into this world, knowing that there would be suffering. Right? Sometimes we look at God and we want to say, it would be wrong for anyone to bring another person into a world when they know that that world will include suffering in their lives. Well, you know what? If we think that, we're not only going to impugn God, we're also going to have to call evil anyone who decides to have a child. So interesting how sometimes we don't hold ourselves to a standard that we hold God to. We look up and blame God for the suffering of this world, the same God who, when he suffered at our hands, he looked down and he said, Father, forgive them. My mom chose to bring me into this world. She knew there would be suffering, but that did not make her evil. Why? Because when the suffering came and my eyes filled with tears, she bent down into the suffering with me, even though that meant suffering at the hands of her own child. And for me, that is a picture of Jesus on the cross, where God did something unthinkable and messy and bloody, where he did not stay on some far-off, distant heavenly throne, unaware of suffering, but he came and he bent down into our suffering with us, even though that meant suffering at the hands of those that he had created. The night before Jesus died, he said, my heart is sorrowful, even to death. I've always thought it's one of the most amazing verses in all of the scriptures, that the God of the universe, the creator of all things, would speak the words, my heart is sorrowful, even to death. Whatever it is that you've been through, there is no depth of agony or helplessness that we can experience in this life that Jesus doesn't understand. And then ultimately, he offers hope. He offers that this is not the end of the story, and that one day we can exist in a place with him that is described in the Bible as a place where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. Why? Little detail in that verse, it says, because God himself will wipe away the tears. It's an amazingly intimate picture of God himself, perhaps Jesus in his physically redeemed body, literally physically wiping away our tears as an invitation into relationship with him for all eternity. I think we need to take seriously when we take suffering. And when I think about my cousin Charles, I think that God chose him before the foundation of the world because he loved him, wanted him to exist, wanted to call him into relationship with himself. That's at the beginning of time. During time, God loved him enough that he was willing to come alongside him and suffer with him. And then at the end of time, I believe God will set things right. Is that a perfect answer? No. But I think for many people, suffering pushes them away from God. I think for me, it's precisely because I feel the challenge of suffering so severely that I'm led to trust a God who can do something about it. I know that's a big question and just a few thoughts, but I hope that they're helpful, and we look forward to the rest of your questions.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Vince. So I guess we're now over to you guys. Our colleague Bob is over here with a microphone if you would like to ask a question live. Otherwise, if you have a question, feel free to write it down either on your ticket or on any $100 bill you happen to have in your pocket and pass it up to the front. And we will do our utmost to try and answer as many of those as we can. Yeah, so long as it's not a fake, says my colleague. And so there may be a few that have already come in. How are we doing? Okay, if you pass your question to the center aisle, just fold it in half, maybe just pass it down the line. No peeking. If you want a pen or paper, just put up your hand, and there are some people here with paper and pens, and they can give you some. Also, I see over there at the end. Okay, we have a question? Okay.
Yes. When a Christian, or authentic Christian, suffers, should it not be a badge of honor? But when non-believers suffer or see suffering, is it not the catalyst that God uses to either question God or bring them to that point, to God?
So was the question about, does God use suffering to bring people to him?
Yes.
Yeah. Do either of you? Lisa, do you want to?
Sure. Can you just repeat part of that again? Sorry, they'd asked me to move the microphone. I missed a bit of that question.
When an authentic Christian, a believer, suffers, should it not be a badge of honor? 2 Corinthians 1, verses 2 to 4. But when non-believers suffer, is it not the catalyst that God uses to either bring them to question God or to bring them to God?
Sure, thank you. I do appreciate the fact that you are trying to look at this from two different perspectives. It's one thing to talk about something when you say, maybe God is doing something in a particular Christian's life, but is it the same kind of idea when someone doesn't claim to have a relationship with God, and yet they seem to be going through something? I was recently speaking with a young girl who lost her mother in a very tragic, sudden way. And this bit of suffering put her in a position where she was like, I really don't want to deal with God at all. I don't want anything to do with him. She's hurt, which is understandable. And for her, it was this experience of, why did God take her? So God intentionally acted and removed her from me, caused this pain, when he actually could have kept it from her and kept it from our family. And so for her, yes, it did push her away. What is interesting, though, is that we began to speak. And one of the things that I began to share with her was actually one of the last things that Vince alluded to. Because I think no matter who you are, you have to respond to this question of suffering, whether you hold a belief or not. All that changes is the answer, but every person has to deal with the question. And what I love about the Christian answer to this is that it isn't just, this is why suffering happens, but it is, as Vince says, it's also about a God who says, I want to enter in and essentially and realistically get bloody with you and enter into this painful moment so you aren't experiencing it alone. And what I shared with her was along those lines, about in this moment of when you are saying to God, I don't want you because I'm angry with you, which is what she honestly shared. And you know what? In those moments, I can't say that I wouldn't have said some of the same things too. Like, let's just be honest with each other. But in that moment, I just tried to encourage her, you know what? The very being that puts you here, the very being that you are fighting against, have you considered that maybe this is the very being that can actually bring you the comfort you're looking for in it? In very much the same way that Vince was talking about, that when you are in these moments of pain, if someone has a cancer diagnosis, who do they want, or who do they find so beneficial, who are they grateful for to come and help them, to talk to them, than somebody who is a cancer survivor? Why? Because they understand. They've had the chemo, they've had the radiation, maybe they've lost the hair, they've had the sickness, they've had all of these things. So how much better to get through a painful situation than with somebody who's been there too? And so while we are pushing against, maybe it can bring somebody towards. And so yes, there is this sense in which it can push people away, but I think it can also, someone who is not saying, you know what, I don't really have this relationship with God, I don't really understand what this means. There is a sense in which when they're in the midst of a suffering situation and they look all around them for answers and they don't find anything that satisfies them, then they actually may say, well, what does Christianity then say? Atheism will tell you, why are you questioning it? Why do you think that you shouldn't have suffering? Why do you feel that suffering is even wrong, that it shouldn't happen? Like, why do you have this expectation in the first place? Islam will tell you that it's part of Allah's will. They wouldn't even call it suffering. They would call it hardship or tough times. So a Muslim wouldn't cry out injustice towards God. They may mourn or grieve, but they would never say this isn't fair because it's part of his will and plan. So you see what I mean? Everybody's answering this question. And if those answers don't satisfy you, and then you encounter Christianity, which says, not only gives an answer, but also says, let me walk with you and mourn with you, there is a sense in which, yeah, suffering can draw people to God. It can do a both kind of thing. It is going to be how they respond. And so I think your question is fair. It is going to be a different response and a different engagement and a different experience based on who they are. But here's the beautiful thing. I don't think God just offers comfort to people who only like to wear red shirts or people who live in one certain country. I think what he says is, look, I'm here, and I'm willing to do this life with you, should you want to do your life with me.
Great question. Here's a question regarding evil. If God created everything, did he create evil? And why would he do that?
Yeah, Vince.
My new favorite quote from Michael. And there's a lot to choose from. Yeah, Vince. Want me to say something?
Yeah, sure.
All right. It's a really insightful question, the sort of question that philosophers like me spend way too much time thinking about. If God created everything, and we live in a world that clearly has a lot of evil and a lot of brokenness, but didn't he create that as well? I don't think so, but here's the way I think about it. And it's a pretty simplistic analogy, but I find it helpful. When I go to a buffet, especially with Michael, because we both really like food, and you see all of the good options in front of you. Everything there is good. In fact, everything looks great. And my problem is that I then go and put a bit of everything on my plate, and I never think to myself, do these foods go together at all? And usually they don't. So I've taken things which all in and of themselves are good, but I've put them together in such a way that they wind up being bad. Now, I think it's a good thing that God has given me the power to move my arm. I think it's a good thing that God has given me free will. The question is, how do I put those good things together? That's where my responsibility comes into play. And did I use the combination of those good things to push Ewan down or to help him up? That's where the question gets real serious and gets turned back on ourselves. So that's the way I think about that God has only created good things, but because he's given us free will, he's given us that choice of how we put the good things together. And sometimes when you put good things together in the wrong way, you wind up with a bad thing. And I think that's where evil comes from. Great question.
Here's a question regarding suicide. What do you think happens in the afterlife to those who take their own lives, and what would God think of this?
Well, should I speak to that? Well, first of all, let me just say, especially since we live in a world where incidents of mental distress are going up through the roof, and the number of people battling with real deep levels of depression is also escalating in almost every single country I've been in. If you're in a situation right now where this is a live issue for you, we would, first of all, love to be able to talk to you after this meeting just personally. And secondly, would also encourage you to find someone who has been given sufficient training just to help you understand what may be going through all of your heart and mind right now. It's an interesting question. We all work in a team that's headed by a guy called Ravi Zacharias, and some of you will know he actually came to faith on a bed of suicide, having unsuccessfully mixed up a very powerful cocktail of drugs to try to end his own life. And as he sometimes put it, he said, for me, he says, despair was no longer a moment, it was simply a way of life. And this seemed to be the best way to exit out of that way. So I think I want to be very careful in how I answer this question, because there are two different things going on here. And it can be very hard to confuse those two messages. The first one is when God is talking to us about not doing something, or that it's wrong, or it's bad, and so on, and this would be one of those things, that word isn't spoken out of hatred or anger. We live in a very confusing culture where we confuse the categories of love and affirmation. So we think if someone loves us, they always affirm us in what we do and want to do. Does that make sense? So if you're not affirmed, therefore you must hate me. And this is one of the reasons why we have such global rising anger right now, because almost everywhere I go, people confuse those two categories. But there is actually a time when love says no. Not out of hatred, but out of concern and care. So when my 4-year-old daughter Lucy wanted to borrow the electric drill, and I said no, and she felt affronted by this, it wasn't because I hated her or was even angry with her about what she was asking. It was out of concern. And the fact that she wanted to play dentist with my 2-year-old son was not a good, excuse as to why she should have it. I don't know if any of you have ever seen something like Alcoholics Anonymous in action, but every so often they may stage an intervention in someone's life, and that normally works with a group of relatives and possibly someone from the organization itself who will confront somebody. And at the time of confronting them, the person will normally respond by saying something like, I thought you loved me. And how could you all betray me? And how could you all gang up on me like this? And how could you, and so on. What you're hoping for is in a couple of years' time, they'll actually come back to you and say, I want to thank you so much for stepping into my life. And if you didn't, I'll probably be dead right now. So they're going to say thank you. So there's a time when love says no and when God says no. So when God says, don't do this, and this is wrong, that's not spoken out of hatred, that's spoken out of concern. Now the question you're asking is even more profound than that, because you're saying, what is the ultimate outcome of that? And I think that's where we're going to have to be really careful. Because it's impossible to know what passes through someone's mind in those very last few seconds. I think there's a reason why we're told the story of how Jesus Christ was crucified between two people either side of him, one of whom called it awfully fine, in a sense, before saying to the Lord, yes. And Jesus said, you'll be with me in paradise today. And this is the amazing thing about forgiveness. Forgiveness takes about a nanosecond. I don't know if you've noticed that. If you've ever wronged somebody, you've done something wrong, and you say sorry, and the person you've offended is willing to forgive you, the next day you see them, you only need to see them for a moment, for a glance, and you know if they've forgiven you. Does that make sense? You can look across the room. They could be miles away. They could be a long way. As long as you can see their eyes, as soon as they come into the room, you can lock eyes with them and know if you've been forgiven. It's the most amazing thing. Well, if it's the case that God is continually offering us this grace and forgiveness, then even after having done something as whatever it may be, taken a cocktail of drugs or whatever else it may be, if in that moment there's that last minute cry, sincere cry out to God, then the answer is, well, yes, of course, they can be with him. So it's very hard to answer that question with any degree of certainty because none of us in this room will know what passes through anyone's heart and mind in those final moments. So we know we can trust God to do what is right, and it's very, very difficult when we are left behind. But I say the main weight I'd almost like to give to that question is to anyone who is wrestling. There are maybe a whole bunch of reasons as to why it seems that global rates of mental distress are going up through the roof. And that's something that we could maybe unpack after this meeting. When the World Health Organization did the largest mental health survey ever on the history of the planet, I remember the results were published in the 2004 major medical journal. And I think the title of the medical journal, the article, if you're interested, was called Prevalence, Severity and Unmet Need in the World Health Survey's Mental Health Survey of 2004, which is why I love these academic articles, because they have such snappy titles. And what that showed was at the point of survey, if you're in an affluent country, at the point of survey, the rate of mental distress was 1 in 4. 25% at the point of survey. You know what that means? That means if you came here tonight with 3 friends and they seem to be doing okay, guess who's in trouble? If you extended those results to say, in the previous 12 months, it goes up to 50%. 50% suffering from acute mental distress in the last 12 months. So we're living in a world where it's becoming increasingly difficult, it seems, to find that kind of emotional and psychological peace and balance in this world. And one of the sad consequences of that is when that's unmet and when that's unresponded to, then for some are going to just take that final step. And it is sadly a pattern we seem to be seeing increasing in lots of different places. I did see an article about a year ago by a very well-known academic who I respect saying, look, the idea that the amount of mental illness in our world is going up is wrong. Just look at the government stats. And it's true, if you look at the government stats, we're all getting better. The trouble is, I've had at least 2 private conversations with government statisticians who compile figures for youth suicide. And I can't name either country for you, but in both of those instances, I actually asked them point blank, just privately, are the figures manipulated? And their response was yes. And they both gave the same reason. We're worried that if we were honest with the extent to which this was happening in our society, it would spark an endemic. That makes sense? If we say it's getting worse, then we could trigger others But if we say it's not true and it's getting better, then maybe it will cause people to restrain. I'm not sure that logic works. I think if you're at that point of despair and you hear that everyone else is getting better apart from you, it can make you feel worse. Does that make sense? Well, why not me then? So then you feel even worse off. So I'm not sure that's the right response. But whatever it is, it's a major problem. But I would like to offer out that ray of hope. And that ray of hope is available for everyone in the room who makes that response, no matter how late in the day it comes and however fleeting it may be.
Why do we need a God to set our moral compass or to create laws and rules for us to follow when we have science based on facts and the rule of law provided by governments?
Mm-hmm. You do it? In one sense, you could argue the reason why we may want to make sure that there is a God who's setting the moral standards. You may have noticed not every government actually sets very good laws. There was a very famous incident during the Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War, where one of the guys defending those who had committed all of the atrocities that they committed in the concentration camps, their argument were, well, these were German citizens obeying German law in German-held territory, so they've done nothing wrong. And there was a very famous professor of jurisprudence, the moral theory of law, who argued they did do nothing wrong in England from Oxford. He said, you can't judge these people, they were obeying the law, so what they did was right. During the actual trials, I can't remember, I think it was the fourth or the fifth or the sixth time this particular defender was defending, saying that they were just obeying the law. The guy threw his hands up in the air and said, but is there not a law above our own laws? Is there not a law above our own laws, which we can decide whether a law is actually just or unjust? And in God's absence, the answer to that question is no. Martin Luther King very famously answered the same question too in his letter from the Birmingham jail, which if you haven't read, I would strongly suggest it's not that long and it's an amazing thing to read. He was criticized for breaking the law. And so when he was in prison in Alabama, a group of pastors actually published a letter against him, saying this guy can't be a real Christian because he's breaking the law. And Martin Luther King very famously started off his letter by saying, look, I don't respond to every criticism I get, otherwise I'll spend nothing but apart from writing letters. He's saying, but since I think you've laid forth an argument well and you're sincere, I want to reply to you sincerely. And at one point in that letter, he says, you're asking me, why do I advocate we should uphold some laws and break others? And he says, and the reason is very simple. He says there are just laws and there are unjust laws. He says a just law is one that is in line with the law given to us by God, and an unjust law is a law which is given to us which is out of line with the law given to us by God. He says, I would argue we have not just simply the right, but the moral duty to protest against an unjust law. He says, but we have to do it peaceably and fairly and be willing to take the consequence for it, i.e. go to jail. And so there is this very important question. If law and what is right is simply what the ruling power says it is, then it means then at that point there's no ability to question whether that law was ever right in the first place. So it is true that we make up our own moral systems. That's completely true. Human beings do that all the time. And we make our own laws. But the fact that we do that still leaves a different question unanswered. Ought it to be different? And is there someone who speaks to that? Do you want to deal with the second part of the question?
Yeah, sure. Just, a thought on, Michael said, this doesn't work if you take God out of the picture. You might say, well, why is that the case? I think about it this way. Most of us in this room, maybe all of us in this room, would agree that for a moral law to be legitimate, it would have to be grounded in the belief in the equal value of every single person. Okay, that every person in this room and every person we walk by in the street every day is equally valuable. Well, here's the question I would want to ask then. If a legitimate, objective, universal morality that can apply to all people everywhere has to be grounded in the equal value of every single person, then there has to be something which is equally true of every single person, in virtue of which every person can be equally valuable. What is it? what is the thing that's true of every single person and completely unchanging, and therefore can ground the equal value of every single person that has to undergird any plausible morality? Take God out of the picture. It's very difficult to answer that question. All of our natural endowments are distributed along a spectrum. Some of us are going to be more useful for society than others. Some of us are going to be better placed to pass on our genes than others. Any sort of scientific or naturalistic way of thinking of that, we're all going to be along a spectrum. So what is the one thing that's equally true of every single one of us and therefore can ground morality? The only thing I can think of is the love of God and the image of God that each one of us is created in. If you take God out of the picture and all you're left with is science and naturalistic science and having in some way to try to manifest a morality based on an evolutionary naturalistic approach to science, I think you wind up in trouble. Because the other side of the survival of the fittest is the death of the weakest. And I think that really contrasts with what we know of Jesus Christ. Not the survival of the fittest, but the fittest, God himself, willingly sacrificing himself for the unfittest, for you and for me. It's quite a different depiction, but I think it's one that can ground the morality that I think we know deep in our hearts is true and what we should follow, that every one of us is equally valuable because there's one thing that's equally true of every single one of us, and that's that we're all created in the image of God.
Let me just add one other thing, because there's another, I'm not sure how the question's meant. There's one other part to do with the science part, which, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is if we have science, we don't really need God anymore. Now, it's true that science explains things really powerfully and well, but you have to ask what it is explaining. So there's an argument that goes a bit like this. We use God to explain the bits we can't explain. Does that make sense? So I use science to explain this, and when I get stuck, I use God to fill in the gaps. And the argument is science has now grown with so much knowledge, those gaps have got increasingly small, to such an extent that God is now literally homeless. Does that make sense? There are no gaps for him to live in anymore, and so we've basically got rid of him. The problem with this line of argument is it confuses two very different categories: law and agency. So scientific law explains, the way things happen. I throw this bottle up in the air and it comes back down. And all of that is explained actually by very simple science that I learned, and there were all kinds of very simple equations, once you know what the force of gravity is, to calculate not just simply how high this thing's going to go when I throw it up, but its trajectory and how it's going to fall. But if you ask the question, why am I throwing this bottle up and down? Well, what part of physics, chemistry, or biology helps explain that? Let me give you another example. The house I live in Oxford is very old. Well, actually, it's not very old. I live on New High Street in Oxford, so my house is new. So it was built in 1880. Old High Street in Headington, the part of Oxford I live in, those houses are from the 1400s. And my house is largely unchanged since it was built in 1880, which is why when you turn the shower on, it feels like there's an old man dribbling on your head. Now, I live in one of those houses that I used to draw as a kid. Does that make sense? You put a door in the middle and a window either side, and it looks exactly like that, with a triangular roof. So my house isn't at all complicated. It can be exhaustively explained through science. Does that make sense? There's no part of its structure, its nature, why it's still standing, and everything else that cannot be explained by science. There are no gaps. But even though I have an exhaustive, total, complete understanding of it, does that mean that there was no architect behind it? And this is what happens when you confuse these categories of law and agency. My scientific understanding of all of the mathematics and physics and everything else governing my house in no way disproves a person behind it who designed it. Does that make sense? So even if we were to have an exhaustive, complete, 100% total understanding of all of the mechanics in our universe and how everything works, not just simply at a big level, but at a quantum level and at a subquantum level, even if we had all of that at our disposal, it's not philosophically capable of disproving an architect behind this universe, a person. It's just simply, it's not philosophically capable of achieving that. And in philosophy, we call it a category error. And it's a fairly common one, so it's just worth highlighting. Does that make sense? Which is why, as Christians, we should ultimately have nothing to fear from science. Because even if we had an exhaustive scientific understanding of this universe, that doesn't mean, therefore, that we've in any way disproved whether there's a mind behind it or not. That's a separate question. It has to be answered separately. There's a colleague of mine. What time is it? What time is it now? How are we doing? You've got my watch. Look at that. He has to look at my watch. I took up my watch and put it on the podium.
It's 9:15.
It's 9:15. What time are we meant to be finishing?
11:30.
We just didn't tell you
11:30. Turns out there isn't a merciful God after all. Is that 10 minutes? So we'll take one more maybe after this, and then we'll let some of you good folks go back home. And then we're prepared to hang around after this just to continue to answer any questions one-on-one as much as we can. This whole question is actually really, really very, very important. It means we have to realize what we are capable of proving and what that itself is actually capable of doing. And I would encourage you, if you have a scientific mind in this room, whether you believe in God or not, you should devote yourself to it, and you may actually be able to do an awful lot of good through it. But it's also limited to what it can do. It's designed to answer particular questions, and it answers them exceptionally well. But there are other types of questions which it's going to struggle to answer because it's not contained within that discipline. It's not something that it can do in and of itself. A colleague of mine, Professor John Lennox, he loves to give an example. And he says, supposing, he says, my Aunt Matilda makes me a cake. And it's this beautiful cake. And in the room, I've got a physicist, a chemist, and a biologist. And the biologist goes to great lengths to explain where all of the ingredients came through and the processes involved in actually producing the germs of wheat and everything else. And the the chemist then explains all the chemical reactions that took place during the whole baking process and why it rose and held firm and everything else. And then the physicist actually then goes into a whole theoretical thing then to explain how actually he can break down all of those processes into mathematics and model the whole thing. And then you ask one of these three scientists, and why did she make the cake? And it doesn't matter how many degrees they have between them, the only person now smiling in the room is Aunt Matilda. Because she's the only person who knows the answer to that particular question, and unless she chooses to reveal it, we will never know. But as soon as she opens her mouth and speaks and says, well, it's because John is my nephew and I love him very much and it's his birthday today, now we have that reason, now we have the why. And so it's just important, as I say, for us to remember what it's called. And there's a very famous book that was published by a Professor Medower a couple of decades ago called The Limits of Science, which is well worth rereading if you've never read it. And you can very easily access it. It's not a particularly big book, which just describes and talks through this particular issue. And so that's where, even in terms of our scientific knowledge, we need a certain degree of humility about what we can and can't do.
All right, well, this is a question regarding the reason to believe in God. Do you feel the need to believe and have others believe in a God simply because you don't know the reason the earth and universe exists? Or do you feel there is a need to believe in a God because humans and mankind cannot be trusted to do the right thing?
Can it be neither of those? Any of you guys want to weigh it in? Well, look, first of all, I'll do a little promo for Alicia. You're going to be talking on reasons.
Yeah, it's actually, I'm going to be speaking on Why Should I Believe on Friday night for youth. I think it's 12 to 17. Is that about right? At Evangelical Church on Friday night, so you can come out and hear that answer.
And if you feel you're 12 to 17, you can come and stand in the back and listen in. Do you want to? Yeah. Yeah, and then I'll do a final point on.
You read it for me one more time?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, the need to believe and have others believe in God simply because you don't know the reason the earth and universe exists, or because humans and mankind cannot be trusted to do the right thing.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And, those are two explanations. There might be other ones as well. Do I believe in God out of need? It's an interesting question. Need is certainly related to it. If there is a God, and he created this universe and he allowed certain needs to exist, and I would expect him to be the best fulfillment of those needs. And I think sometimes we're really good at distracting ourselves from the realities of our needs and our broken condition. I saw a commercial a while back, kind of an odd commercial, but it depicted a woman giving birth, and then this baby flew through the air and over 30 seconds progressed through the entire progression of life while flying through the air. So kind of a baby, and then a young child, and an adolescent, and then an adult, and then got older, and then at the end of the commercial, crashed down into a grave, dead. And then the screen went black, and then these words appeared across the screen. Life is short, play more Xbox. And I sort of responded, like you guys. I mean, I laughed, it was funny, and then kind of halfway through my laugh, I started to catch myself too, and I thought, boy, that's really funny, but it's also devastating. Life is short, and it's unjust, and everything on this earth is ultimately headed towards death and injustice. What's the best we have in response? Is it really play more Xbox, spend more time on Facebook and Instagram and social media, and try to distract yourself in any way that you can so you don't have to think about the reality of that situation? I always find it interesting when I see rankings of people's top fears and public speaking comes in ahead of death. People think that what we're doing right now is scarier than the fact that life is short. There is a reality that we walk around with deep needs, and sometimes people say, is Christianity just a crutch? I want to say, no, it's not just a crutch. But boy, sometimes I do need a crutch. Sometimes I do need some help. And if I was created by a God that was going to allow me to exist in a world where he knew I would need help, then I shouldn't be surprised if he's the best answer to my needs. All sorts of needs throughout life. We've talked about anxiety. We've talked about sometimes thinking even of suicide and that this life is not worth living. We've talked about the shortness of life. If we get ourselves sometimes away from just our distractions, Pascal said, wonderful theologian, and he said, our trouble is our inability to sit in a room quietly. He said if we would just spend some time alone with the reality of the world we're living in and our thoughts, we would realize that there are deep needs, and that should point us towards something which can fulfill those needs. So yes, absolutely, needs are a part of it. But it's not just wish fulfillment. Okay, I believe in something that I believe is true. And Alicia spoke about Jesus' death earlier, and as we go those 3 more days and then get to Jesus' resurrection, that is a large part of why I came to believe. I could see the needs, I could see that God was the fulfillment of the needs, but I still needed to ask that question, is it true? Because if you're falling off a cliff, Tim Keller gives this example, and you reach up and you grab a branch, okay, whether you feel that that branch is going to hold you is not ultimately what determines your fate. It's how strong that branch is that determines your fate. And I saw the need, I began to pursue the evidence, and that led me to the resurrection of Jesus. And I became a Christian in large part because I looked into the resurrection of Jesus, and I would encourage you to do the same. But it is utterly unique, the fact that we can look back at the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And when you look at that, not taking the Bible initially and assuming it's true, but just looking at the historical evidence, you have what should have been the movement-ending death of Jesus. He had these followers. He claimed to be divine. They thought he was the Messiah. They thought he was going to rise to power, become a powerful earthly king that was going to rescue the Jewish people from the heavy hand of Rome. And then he died. Should have been movement over. And then, 3 days later, you get the absolute eruption of Christianity. Within probably just months, you have a creed that's being circulated around the churches that lists all of the different people and groups that Jesus had appeared to, including at one point more than 500 at once. And it says in parentheses, most of whom are still living, as if to say, if you don't believe me, these people are still walking around. Go out and ask them for yourself. We have someone who we worked with in Oxford. He's the head philosopher of religion there, was for many years. He's emeritus now. He published a book in 2003. It's called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And in that book, he argues that on the available evidence today, it is 97% probable that Jesus truly, physically, bodily, miraculously rose from the dead. Now, he's not asking us to take the exact percentage too seriously. He likes to work with probability theory, so he plugs in estimates at different points in the argument. But the fact that someone of his intellectual credibility can make that claim, make it in print, have it be published by Oxford University Press, and then ably defend that claim at top academic conferences all around the world speaks to the fact that the intellectual case for Christianity is extremely strong. And if you haven't looked into that, please do. I was so encouraged when I first read through the scriptures and I came to the Acts of the Apostles and I read that the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Not for blind faith, not because they parked their brain at the door, but because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what they were being told was true. I thought I could get behind that. And I remember praying to God, I'm not sure if I'm talking to anyone, but if I am, I would really like to know about it. And I remember thinking to myself that if God created me and if he created me with this mind, then he would want an honest intellectual search to at least point in his direction, and that is exactly what we found. Sometimes we think that it's our minds that keep us from God. Much more common is that it's our hearts that keep us from God. And if we're willing to put in a bit of that effort, we'll find that the intellectual objections get cleared away, and that will open up a path for God to speak directly to our hearts and then to transform them.
This is our last question. As a young person living in today's society, I've struggled with these questions. What is the purpose of life? What's the point of existing? Why has God created us? What's the point?
Okay, it's a great question to end on. And again, if you're still here and you would like to talk, please do come up, and maybe even if time runs out tonight, we could pick up this conversation by email. The question is a very, 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 very good one for at least two reasons. Number one, we're beginning to live in a world where we think we're all responsible for generating our own truth. And if that's the case, if we're all responsible for generating our own truth, that also means we're also responsible for generating our own meaning in this world. It's not something you're going to discover or find, it's something that you have to make for yourself. Well, that puts onto every human being an incredibly heavy burden. Make sense? You are literally responsible for generating meaning. And that's very, very large. There's a difference between finding meaning in life and feeling you have to generate it out of nothing. One is much more exhausting than the other. Let me try and tie this into that other question that Vince was just speaking to. A very well-known person, I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of him, the Oxford professor C.S. Lewis, who was also a professor at Cambridge too, when he defected briefly, and then came back to the mothership. He very famously said in one of his books, The Problem of Pain, which was one of the earliest books he wrote, he said, if you would ask me before, when I was an atheist, because he was an atheist well into his 30s, he said, if you were to ask me why I'm an atheist, I would basically say, look at this world. We exist by inflicting pain on each other. Look at the universe. It's largely empty, cold, dead space. He says we live in a cold universe. We're surrounded by all of this death. I'm summarizing here. It takes him 10 pages to write this. He says, how can you possibly expect me to believe that this is the product of a loving God and he has any particular purpose for me? Okay, much better to reconcile yourself to the fact that this is just the way it is, okay, and just make of it what you will. He said, that would have been my argument. And if you want to read that, he argues it incredibly strongly in the beginning part of his book, The Problem of Pain. So strongly that when you get to the end of those 10 pages, you fear he may have dug a hole so deep, he can't possibly get himself out of it. But he's just trying to be honest with the depth of the argument he felt he had. Now, but one of the interesting things that happened for him was he was wrestling with the person of Jesus Christ. It wasn't so much that C.S. Lewis sat down and figured out, you know what, there must be a God behind this world. He felt that somehow his world was invaded by God. And the more he looked at Jesus Christ and the person of Jesus Christ, the more he became convinced that this wasn't just any mere person or mere man. This was literally God, who broke into space-time history and revealed and made himself known. And C.S. Lewis was so worried about this, so worried about the implications of this for him as an atheist in his 30s, this brilliant young professor. He went and found a professor of ancient history at Oxford, who, in C.S. Lewis's words, were the most secure atheist he knew. And he went to him to get talked out of his fear that he was going to get converted. And so he went to go and visit this professor to sort of get reassurance that his atheism was right. And he describes the scene how they were sat in this guy's study. And this eminent historian is sitting, puffing his pipe with the port in one hand in front of a fire. And C.S. Lewis is there with his pipe and port in the other hand. And in one of this very quiet, slow-moving conversation, this other guy, this professor of ancient history, he took the pipe out of his mouth and said, "Lewis, it's a rum thing," which, if you don't know what that means in modern English, it's a strange thing. He says, "It looks like that resurrection thing may have actually have happened to Jesus," and then put the pipe back in his mouth. And C.S. Lewis says he felt utterly despondent, literally like the bottom had fallen out of his world. He says he walked out of that study that day feeling completely dejected, saying if the most secure atheist I knew, who'd also looked at the evidence, had come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ had indeed been raised from the dead and was indeed God, then what hope was there for me? He said, to maintain my atheism. He says, and that night, he says, I went back to my room and I became the most reluctant convert in all of England. When I finally said, okay. Now, why am I telling you this? In the book of Revelation, it says that by God's will, we are and are created. That means that in answer to your question about why and why you're here, there are two things that need to be said. Number one, because God actually wants you. He actually wanted you. Not someone else, not someone better or different or alternate or stronger or wiser or whatever it is. He wanted you. He actually desired for you to come into this world. He wanted you. And the second thing is he wants to be in relationship with you. If you want to know the reason why something was brought into the world, the best thing to do is to ask the maker about why they made it in the first place. And if you want to know what your particular reason for being is, then the best place you can do that is to be in relationship with the one who wanted you and created you. And the amazing thing is he calls all of us. After the death and resurrection, Mary went to see the empty tomb. And she starts talking to Jesus. She assumes he must be the gardener initially because he can't be alive, he must be dead. And she says, just show me where you've hidden the body, because she assumes that for some reason the gardeners decided to keep the body as some kind of trophy and hidden it. And she basically gives him a legal out. She says, I'm not interested in prosecuting you, I'm not going to report you, just tell me what you did, okay? I'll put it right, I've got your back covered, I'm not interested in getting into trouble, I just want you to know what you did with him. And at this point, she thinks she's asking for everything. Does that make sense? She feels she's asking for the earth. But the trouble is she's not asking for too much, she's actually asking for too little. She would have been satisfied with a corpse, but actually there's a living Christ in front of her. And then he calls her by name, Mary. And at that point, she recognizes who he is. And he actually calls all of us by name. And he calls your name too. And there is a reason why he wanted you here. And there's a reason why you are here. The general reason is out of his love for you, and he wants to have this relationship and this walk with you. In order to find the specifics, entering into that relationship is the context within which you'll find the specific reason why you are actually here and why he actually wants you and is calling you by name. And I wouldn't want to end this evening without at least giving the response, or the opportunity for response, because I realize for some of you would have come here tonight and you've been very polite and listened, and you're thinking, I've still got a whole bunch of questions, I'm not even close to being convinced. The answer is very firmly no. Well, we're still glad that you're here, and we would love to talk to you afterwards. And for other of you, you may be thinking, maybe there's something in this, I'm just not sure. Well, again, thanks for coming. Please ask your questions. We're more than delighted to try and answer them. But it's also possible in an evening like this, you're listening to this and you're thinking, actually, for me, the answer is yes. For me, I need to say yes to that call on my life. And if that's where you are, please don't leave this room without talking with someone tonight or just leave your email and name on a piece of paper and we'll get in touch with you. Because that's one of the single most important decisions that you'll ever make. And it does begin to change everything. Since this is the last question, I'd just like to thank the organizers for pulling this together. Thank you very, very much. We appreciate your hospitality. Sorry for arriving a day late. I'll try not to do that again if you invite me back. I'm still hoping to come here one day with my family so they can actually see this beautiful place and meet you. You're one of the kindest, most responsive audiences that we ever get to speak to, and that's a delight too. And I'd just like to thank Vince and Alicia for willing to join me. And since I'm in that mode, I may as well thank myself too. Thank you very much. Hope you have a good night, and thank you for being with us tonight.